Victoria DiGiorgio sat at a corner table in a Brooklyn social club on a Saturday evening in March 1962, watching John Gotti laugh with three men whose names she didn't know. She was 19 years old. He was 21. They had been seeing each other for 4 months, and already she understood that when he was with those men, any men from the neighborhood, really, she became furniture, not ignored exactly, acknowledged with a hand on her shoulder when he passed, a wink when he caught her eye, but fundamentally elsewhere in his attention. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and marinara sauce. Someone's mother was cooking in the back. Victoria's own mother, half Russian and Jewish, would never set foot in a place like this. Her father might, but he'd already made clear what he thought of John Gotti, a small-time hustler from a family with nothing, going nowhere. Victoria had stopped listening. John had a magnetism her father lacked, a certainty about the world and his place in it that made her quiet uncertainties feel like something that could be solved by proximity. She didn't know then that this moment, the waiting, the watching, the translation of absence into loyalty, was not courtship, but training. That 50 years later she would still be sitting in rooms where decisions were made without her, waiting for a man who would never fully arrive. The engagement ring came 2 months after that night. The pattern was already set. Victoria DiGiorgio was born in Brooklyn in December 1942 to parents who should never have married. Her father was Italian, her mother Russian-Jewish. A combination that in that neighborhood, in that era, marked the family as perpetually out of place. The DiGiorgios were not poor, but they were not quite anything. Not fully Italian, not fully Jewish, not fully American, despite being born there. Victoria grew up watching her mother navigate the Italian women on the block with careful distance, never quite invited in, never quite excluded. Her father moved between both worlds and belonged to neither. She learned early that belonging required erasure. At school, she was Victoria DiGiorgio, Italian enough. At home, her mother spoke Russian when she was angry, Yiddish when she was tired, English when she wanted to be understood. Victoria answered only in English. She learned to make herself smaller, less complicated, to be whatever the room required. By the time she was 16, she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's capacity for silence. She was pretty in a way that didn't call attention to itself, the kind of pretty that made men look twice but not make a scene. She worked part-time at a neighborhood diner, saved money for clothes she saw in magazines, and understood instinctively that her future depended on who she married. John Gotti was not what her parents wanted, but he was what the neighborhood respected. She met him in 1961 at a club in East New York. He was already known, not famous, but known. Part of a crew that ran numbers, moved stolen goods, collected debts. He had served time in Lewisburg for a truck hijacking and came out harder, sharper, more certain of what the world owed him. He wore his suits like armor. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to take what he wanted. Victoria had dated other boys from the neighborhood, nice boys with steady jobs and mothers who cooked Sunday dinner, boys who would marry her and expect children and tolerate her half-Russian mother at holidays. John was different. When he looked at her, she felt chosen, not loved exactly, but selected for a role she didn't yet understand. Their courtship happened in increments of his availability. He would appear on a Tuesday evening, unannounced, and take her to dinner at a restaurant where the owner knew his name. They would sit in the back, and men would approach the table to speak with him quietly, while Victoria studied the menu. He never explained who they were. She never asked. When he walked her home, he kissed her in the doorway, like he was sealing a contract. Then he would disappear for a week. No phone calls, no explanations. She would see him on the corner with his crew, laughing, gesturing, holding court. He would wave at her like she was a distant acquaintance. She learned to wait without asking questions, to accept presence and absence as two forms of the same attention. Her father told her John Gotti would end up dead or in prison. Her mother said nothing, which was worse. Victoria understood their concern as fear of her choosing badly, of ruining herself by association with someone beneath their limited but real aspirations for her. She heard their warnings as proof they didn't understand what she had already recognized, that marrying John Gotti meant never being invisible again. The engagement happened in May 1962. No romantic proposal, no bent knee. John told her over dinner at a restaurant in Queens that they would get married in March, that his mother was already planning it, that she should quit her job at the diner because his wife wouldn't work. Victoria said yes because the alternative, saying no, didn't exist in the grammar of their relationship. She wore the ring, a small diamond in a gold setting, and felt the weight of it as both promise and erasure. The months before the wedding, Victoria lived in a strange suspension. She was no longer her parents' daughter in any meaningful sense. Her mother's disapproval had calcified into cold civility, her father's warnings into silence. But she was not yet John's wife. She existed in a gap between identities, and the gap felt like drowning. John's mother, Fanny, took over the wedding preparations with the territorial efficiency of someone claiming property. She dismissed Victoria's suggestions about flowers, about the reception hall, about the guest list. "The goddess do it this way," she said, and that was the end of discussion. Victoria attended meetings about her own wedding as an observer. She smiled and nodded and learned another lesson, that becoming John's wife meant joining a family that would never consider her fully one of them. The wedding took place on March 6, 1962, at Our Lady of Mount Carmel in Williamsburg. Victoria wore a white dress her mother-in-law had chosen. The church was full of people she didn't know. John's crew sat in the back rows, watching. During the ceremony, John looked at her exactly once when the priest said, "You may kiss the bride." The kiss was brief and performative. She remembers thinking that she had just signed something she hadn't read. The reception was held at a social club in East New York. There was food and music and dancing. John spent most of the night at a table with men from the Gambino family, including Carlo Gambino himself, a skeletal man in an expensive suit who nodded at Victoria once and then ignored her. She sat with John's sisters and their husbands, women who spoke around her rather than to her, and understood that this was her future: proximity to power, permanent exclusion from its exercise. They honeymooned for 3 days in the Catskills. John spent most of the time on the phone. When he hung up, he told her they were cutting the trip short. Something had come up, business that couldn't wait. Victoria packed her suitcase and said nothing. On the drive back to Brooklyn, John talked about buying a house, about starting a family, about his plans to move up in the organization. He used the word we, but meant himself. They moved into a small house in East New York, a few blocks from the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club where John spent most of his time. The house was furnished with money Victoria didn't ask about. She cooked meals John rarely ate at home. She learned the rhythm of his absences, the late nights, the unexplained trips, the phone calls he took in another room. She learned which questions were allowed. "When will you be home?" was acceptable. "Where were you?" was not. Within 6 months of marriage, Victoria was pregnant. The pregnancy felt less like a beginning than a confirmation of function. John was pleased in the abstract way men are pleased by proof of virility, but uninterested in the physical reality of it. He didn't attend doctor's appointments. He didn't discuss names or nurseries. When Victoria's morning sickness kept her in bed, he stayed out later. She gave birth to their daughter, Angela, in April 1963. John visited the hospital once, brought flowers, stayed 20 minutes. His mother came daily and made clear through small corrections that Victoria was doing everything slightly wrong. The baby cried, and Victoria held her in the small house in East New York and understood with absolute clarity that she was alone. John's career in the Gambino family accelerated. More nights away, more money appearing without explanation, more men at the door at strange hours. Victoria kept the house clean, kept the baby fed, kept her questions to herself. She had married into a world with rules she was still learning, and the first rule was simple. You don't see what you see. You don't know what you know. Her parents visited once after Angela was born. Her mother held the baby and said nothing. Her father looked around the house, at the new furniture, the expensive stroller, the leather coat hanging by the door, and asked Victoria if she was happy. She said yes because the word required less explanation than the truth. They left and didn't come back. Victoria understood it as abandonment, but also as permission. She was fully John's now. There was no other family to return to, no other identity to reclaim. She was Mrs. Gotti, mother of Angela Gotti, keeper of a house in East New York that belonged to a man who was rarely in it. By 1964, she was pregnant again. The second pregnancy was different only in that Victoria now understood what it meant. Another child was another anchor, another reason she couldn't leave, even if leaving had occurred to her as a possibility. Victoria Jr. was born in November 1964, and John reacted with the same detached approval he'd shown for Angela. He wanted sons, he'd told her once, but daughters were fine for now. The conditional acceptance felt like everything else in the marriage. Provisional, subject to revision based on needs she could not predict or control. The Bergen Hunt and Fish Club sat on 100 First Avenue in Ozone Park, a squat brick building with blacked-out windows that pretended to be a social club and was. Men went in and out at all hours. No one hunted, no one fished. John spent more time there than he did in the house Victoria kept obsessively clean, as if perfect countertops and folded laundry could substitute for his presence. She learned the hierarchy by watching who spoke and who listened. Carlo Gambino was the boss, a man whose silence carried more weight than other men's shouting. Agnello Della Croce was underboss, and it was Della Croce who became John's mentor and protector within the family. John worshipped him with an intensity he never showed Victoria. When Della Croce spoke, John leaned forward. When Della Croce laughed, John laughed louder. Victoria understood she was married to a man whose primary relationship was with other men, with a structure of loyalty and violence she would never fully penetrate. Her job was maintenance, keep the house, raise the children. Look good when he needed her to look good. Don't embarrass him. Don't ask questions. Don't get close to the other wives in ways that might breed dangerous intimacy or loose talk. The Gambino family had rules about wives. They were to be provided for, protected, and kept separate from business. Victoria was given money every week in cash. She didn't know where it came from. She learned to shop without receipts, to pay for everything in bills John handed her, without comment. In 1965, she was pregnant again. John Jr. was born in February 1966, and this time John's pleasure was visible. A son, an heir. He showed up at the hospital with cigars and his crew. They filled the room with cigarettes and loud voices, and Victoria held the baby and felt herself recede further into the background of her own life. The late 1960s brought more arrests, more trials, more unexplained absences. John was picked up for hijacking, for bookmaking, for assault. He beat most of the charges through lawyers Victoria never met and legal strategies she didn't understand. When he went to jail for short stints, she visited on designated days, brought the children when he asked for them, and sat across from him in visiting rooms that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. He gave her instructions. Pay this person, tell that person he'd be in touch. Don't talk to anyone about anything. She nodded and complied. The neighborhood knew what John did. Everyone knew. It was spoken about in code and silences, in the way people moved aside when he walked down the street, in the way shopkeepers refused his money. Victoria walked through this knowledge daily, at the grocery store, at church, at Angela's school. She was John Gotti's wife, which meant she was treated with a deference that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with fear. Other wives tried to befriend her. Wives of other made men, women who understood the specific loneliness of marriage to the mob. Victoria kept them at a distance. John had made it clear. No close friendships, no confidences. You never knew who was listening, who might turn, who might use something said in a moment of weakness. So Victoria smiled and made small talk, and never said anything true. Her fourth pregnancy came in 1967. Another son, Frank, born in October. 4 children in 5 years. Victoria's body had become a factory for producing goddess. She was 25 years old and felt 40. The house was constantly full and constantly empty. Children everywhere, but no adult conversation, no partnership, no shared decision-making. John came home when he came home. He played with the kids in brief, intense bursts of attention that they craved, and Victoria resented. He was the fun parent, the one who brought presents and told stories. She was the one who woke up at 2 a.m. when Frank had colic, who changed diapers and made meals and enforced bedtime. Money was no longer a problem. John was moving up, taking on more responsibility, earning more. The house filled with new furniture, new appliances. Victoria wore better clothes. But the money came with a price she was beginning to understand. Every dollar was evidence, every purchase potentially a target for federal prosecutors building cases. She learned to be vague about where things came from. A gift, she'd say, on sale. The lies became automatic. In 1969, John was arrested again, this time for a hijacking that would send him to Lewisburg for 3 years. He was convicted in 1970. Victoria was 28, with 4 children under 8. The day he went away, he told her to keep the house together, to make sure the kids remembered him, to visit every week. He did not ask if she could manage. He assumed she would. She did. The 3 years John spent in Lewisburg were the longest continuous period of Victoria's adult life without him. And they were not easier. She raised the children alone, managed the house alone, and lived with the knowledge that the neighborhood was watching to see if she'd fail, if she'd crack, if she'd prove herself unworthy of the Gotti name. John's mother visited weekly to supervise, to offer criticism disguised as help. The crew checked in periodically, dropping off envelopes of cash and coded messages from John. Victoria visited every week. She drove 3 hours to the prison, brought the children once a month, and sat across from John in a visiting room where he talked about his plans for when he got out, who'd betrayed him, who was solid, what moves he'd make. He asked about the children in the abstract, how they were doing in school, if they were staying out of trouble. He did not ask about her. She understood by then that she was infrastructure, not a person with her own internal life that might require attention. The children grew. Angela became quiet and watchful, already learning to read a room the way Victoria had. Victoria Jr. was louder, more demanding, testing boundaries Victoria couldn't quite enforce without John there to back her up. John Jr. was his father's son even at 4 years old, charming, manipulative, aware of his own power. Frank was the baby, sweet and needy and too young to understand why his father lived somewhere else. In 1972, John was released. He came home to a clean house, well-fed children, and a wife who had learned to function without him. He moved back in like he'd never left. The first night, he went to the Bergen. Victoria put the children to bed and sat in the living room, waiting. He came home at 3 a.m, smelling of cigars and someone else's perfume, and fell asleep on the couch without explanation. She went upstairs and lay in bed and understood that the 3 years hadn't changed anything, except her certainty that this was her life forever. The mid-1970s were a blur of routine. John worked his way back into the family's good graces, taking orders from Della Croce, running crews, making money. Victoria was pregnant again, her 5th and final child, Peter, born in 1974. 5 children, 32 years old. Her body had given everything it had to give. John was around more, but present less. He'd sit at the dinner table and his mind would be elsewhere. He'd play with the kids for 10 minutes and then disappear for 3 days. Victoria learned to translate his moods, when to speak, when to stay silent, when to make herself invisible. The best days were the ones when he was in a good mood and included her in it, when he'd take her to dinner and hold her hand and make her feel like she mattered. Those days became rarer. The neighborhood changed. Old mobsters died or went to prison. New ones rose. John was ambitious in a way that worried Victoria without her being able to articulate why. He talked about making boss, about running things, about getting the respect he deserved. He talked about it with an intensity that felt dangerous, like he was willing to burn everything down to get what he wanted. In 1976, Carlo Gambino died. Paul Castellano, Gambino's brother-in-law, became boss. John hated him immediately. Castellano was rich, lived in a mansion in Staten Island, looked down on men like John who came from the streets. The resentment in John was visible. He'd come home from meetings and rage about Castellano's rules, Castellano's disrespect, Castellano's weakness. Victoria listened and said nothing. She was learning that her silence was the only thing he really required from her. The late 1970s brought more money and more danger. The FBI was everywhere. Phones were tapped, cars were followed. Victoria learned to assume every conversation was being recorded. She stopped saying anything of substance on the phone. She taught the children the same. By the time Angela was 15, she already knew not to talk about her father's business, not to bring friends to the house, not to trust anyone outside the family. The money kept coming. The house in East New York wasn't enough anymore. John wanted something bigger, something that announced his status. In 1979, they moved to Howard Beach, to a house that was more mansion than home. Victoria walked through rooms she hadn't chosen, filled with furniture she hadn't picked, and understood that the house was not for her. It was for John, a monument to what he'd become. She decorated it anyway. Chose curtains and paint colors and where to put the photographs. She made it look like a home even though it felt like a museum. The children had their own rooms. There was a yard. It should have felt like success. It felt like a larger cage. In March 1980, everything changed. Frank, 12 years old, was riding a motorized minibike in the neighborhood. He darted into the street. John Favara, a neighbor, was driving home from work. He hit Frank. The boy was rushed to the hospital. He died the next day. Victoria's grief was immediate and absolute. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, locked herself in Frank's room and wouldn't come out. John's grief was different. It was rage. He blamed Favara. Didn't matter that it was an accident, that Frank had driven into traffic, that Favara was destroyed by what had happened. John wanted blood. Favara disappeared 4 months later, kidnapped, presumably killed, body never found. Victoria knew John was involved. Everyone knew. No one said it. Favara's wife moved away. The whole neighborhood went silent about it, and Victoria understood with absolute clarity that her husband was capable of murder, that he'd killed a man for an accident, that grief and revenge were the same thing to him. She never spoke about it, not to John, not to the children, not to herself in any conscious way. She buried it along with Frank, and the burial felt like losing 2 children instead of 1. The boy was gone, and whatever part of her had still believed John was something other than what he was, that died too. Frank's room stayed exactly as it was for 2 years. Victoria wouldn't let anyone touch it. The minibike poster on the wall, the baseball mitt on the dresser, the clothes in the closet, all of it preserved like a shrine to a child who would never grow up. She went in there every day and sat on the bed and felt nothing. The grief had calcified into something harder and more permanent than sadness. It was a stone in her chest that made breathing difficult. John never went into the room. He dealt with Frank's death by erasing it from conversation. The family didn't talk about Frank. When the other children mentioned him, John changed the subject or left the room. Victoria watched her husband perform this erasure and understood it as cowardice. He could order a man killed, but couldn't sit with the death of his own son. The contradiction didn't surprise her anymore. The other children absorbed the silence in different ways. Angela, 17 by then, became the household manager Victoria could no longer be. She made meals, helped Peter with homework, ran interference when John came home in a mood. She had her mother's watchfulness and her father's ability to read power dynamics. She started dating a boy from the neighborhood, and Victoria saw in her daughter's eyes the same calculation she'd once made. Marry someone connected. Marry someone who matters. Marry your way into safety. Victoria Jr., 15, went the opposite direction. She was loud where Angela was quiet, defiant where her sister was compliant. She fought with John constantly, about clothes, about curfews, about boys. The fights were screaming matches that ended with doors slamming and John storming out. Victoria Jr. learned early that she could wound her father by embarrassing him, and she used that knowledge like a weapon. She wore makeup John thought was too heavy. She talked back in front of his crew. She was performing her own kind of rebellion, and Victoria recognized it as the only form of power a Gotti daughter could claim. John Jr., 14, was being groomed. John took the boy to the Bergen, introduced him to the crew, taught him the rituals and hierarchies of the life. Victoria watched her son learn to shake hands a certain way, to stand a certain way, to listen more than he spoke. The boy worshipped his father with an intensity that frightened her. He wanted to be exactly what John was, and John encouraged it with a pride he'd never shown about anything else. Victoria saw her son's future written in every approving nod from his father, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be betrayal. Peter, 6 years old when Frank died, became the ghost child. He was quiet and anxious, prone to nightmares. He clung to Victoria in ways that annoyed John. "You're making him soft," John said, and Victoria pulled away from the boy just enough to satisfy her husband. She watched Peter learn to hide his fear, to perform toughness he didn't feel, and she hated herself for teaching him that love was conditional. The house in Howard Beach became a performance space. John's status in the Gambino family was rising, which meant more visitors, more meetings held in the dining room, while Victoria served coffee and pastries and then disappeared. She learned to read the tension in these gatherings, who sat where, who spoke when, whose opinions John dismissed or amplified. The house was bugged. Everyone knew it. Conversations happened in code, in the yard, in corners away from obvious surveillance. Victoria moved through her own home like a spy in enemy territory. In 1983, John became a made man in a formal ceremony Victoria was not told about until after. He came home that night, drunk and expansive, talking about loyalty and brotherhood and respect. He grabbed her and danced her around the kitchen while she smiled and felt nothing. Being made meant he was untouchable within the family structure, protected by omerta, bound by blood oaths. It also meant he could never leave, never retire, never choose a different life. Not that he wanted to. This was everything he'd ever wanted. The money increased. So did the scrutiny. FBI agents sat in cars outside the house, photographing everyone who came and went. They followed the children to school. They approached Victoria in grocery store parking lots, asking if she'd like to talk, if she knew what her husband really did, if she was afraid. She learned to walk past them without making eye contact, to say nothing, to treat their presence as weather, unpleasant but inevitable. The children learned the same. Don't talk to strangers. Don't answer questions. Don't bring anyone home without permission. The house was under siege, and the siege made them closer in some ways and more isolated in others. They were Gottis, which meant they were different, separate, permanently marked. Angela's boyfriend broke up with her after FBI agents visited his parents. Victoria Jr.'s friends stopped calling. John Jr. got into fights at school with boys who called his father a criminal. Peter stopped trying to make friends at all. Victoria tried to create normalcy. She insisted on family dinners when John was home, on church on Sundays, on birthday parties and holiday traditions. But the normalcy was performance, and everyone knew it. John would sit at the head of the table and hold court, telling stories about the neighborhood, about guys he knew, about scores and schemes translated into vague language that meant nothing and everything. The children laughed at his jokes. Victoria served food. They were a family in the way stage actors are a family, performing prescribed roles for an invisible audience. In 1984, Agnello Della Croce had a birthday party at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy. John brought the whole family. Victoria dressed the children in their best clothes and wore a dress John had bought her without asking what she liked. The club was full of mobsters and their wives, and Victoria sat with women she'd known for years but never really talked to. They discussed recipes and children and complained about their husbands in the careful, coded way women did when they knew their conversations might be evidence. Della Croce sat at the center of everything, old and sick but still commanding respect through sheer force of presence. John orbited him like a moon, laughing too loud at his jokes, agreeing too enthusiastically with his opinions. Victoria watched her husband perform subordination and understood that everything he did at home, the dominance, the control, the need to be deferred to, was compensation for the fact that in the only world that mattered to him, he was still answering to other men. The party went late. Children fell asleep in booths. Victoria held Peter and watched John drink and wondered what would happen when Della Croce died, because he was dying. Everyone could see it. Cancer was eating him from the inside, and when he was gone, the protection he offered John would be gone too. Paul Castellano hated John. The feeling was mutual and barely concealed. Della Croce was the only thing keeping that hatred from turning into something worse. They drove home in the early morning, children asleep in the back seat. John was drunk and expansive. He talked about how the family was weak under Castellano, how things needed to change, how he and Angelo Ruggiero and the crew could run things better. Victoria listened and felt dread settle over her, like a blanket. Her husband was talking about a coup. He didn't use the word, but that's what it was. And coups in the mob ended with bodies. She didn't say anything. What was there to say? John had never asked her opinion about his business, and he wasn't asking now. He was just talking, and she was just there to listen. It was the fundamental structure of their marriage. He acted. She absorbed the consequences. By 1985, the dread proved correct. Della Croce was dying in earnest now. Castellano was planning to dismantle John's crew, to punish them for drug dealing Castellano had explicitly forbidden. John and the others were facing either death or permanent exile from the family. Victoria didn't know the details, but she knew the temperature. John came home tense and paranoid. He checked the house for bugs. He had conversations in the bathroom with the shower running. He stopped sleeping through the night. In December, Della Croce died. John attended the wake, came home, and didn't speak for 2 days. Victoria made meals he didn't eat. She kept the children quiet. She waited for whatever was coming next. On December 16, 1985, Paul Castellano was shot to death outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, along with his bodyguard Thomas Bellotti. 3 gunmen in identical trench coats, rush hour traffic, a hit so public and brazen it made national news. Victoria was at home when she heard. She turned on the television and saw the covered bodies on the street and knew with absolute certainty that John was involved. He came home late that night. She was in the kitchen. He looked at her and she looked at him, and nothing was said. He went upstairs. She stayed in the kitchen. The television was still on in the other room, reporters talking about mob violence and gang warfare. Victoria turned it off and sat in the dark and understood that her husband had just made himself the most powerful and most endangered man in New York. 2 weeks later, John Gotti became boss of the Gambino crime family. He was 45 years old. He'd climbed over bodies to get there, including, Victoria believed, the body of his own boss. The news called him the Dapper Don. They ran photos of him in expensive suits coming out of the Ravenite, smiling for cameras. He was famous now, not just known in the neighborhood, but famous across the country. And Victoria, who had spent 23 years trying to maintain some privacy, some separation between her family and the world, understood that privacy was over. She was now married to the most famous mobster in America, and there was no part of her life that wouldn't be public, performed, and judged. The children reacted in their predictable ways. Angela withdrew further. Victoria Jr. seemed energized by the attention, already learning how to commodify the Gotti name. John Jr. swelled with pride. His father was boss, which made him prince. Peter had nightmares about men in trench coats. Victoria said nothing to any of them. She kept the house running. She attended functions when required. She smiled for cameras when John wanted her to. And at night, alone in a bed he rarely slept in anymore, she thought about Frank's room down the hall, still preserved exactly as it was, and wondered if she was mourning her son or mourning the version of herself that had died with him. The photographers started appearing in January 1986. They camped outside the house in Howard Beach, long lenses pointed at windows, cameras clicking whenever anyone came or went. Victoria learned to close the curtains before dawn, to check the street before letting the children leave for school, to plan her grocery shopping around moments when the surveillance might be lighter. There were no such moments. John loved it. He dressed for the cameras every morning, custom suits from Italy, silk ties, perfectly styled hair. He walked out of the Ravenite like he was walking a red carpet, pausing to let them get their shots, sometimes waving, always smiling. The newspapers called him the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don when charges didn't stick. He kept the clippings. Victoria found them in his desk drawer once, articles about his acquittals, profiles calling him the most powerful mobster in America, photographs of him looking like a movie star. He was proud of his own mythology in a way that made her feel invisible, because for every photo of John, there were 10 where Victoria appeared in the background or edge of frame, getting into a car, carrying groceries, hurrying children inside. The papers described her as Gotti's long-suffering wife, or the mobster's spouse, or sometimes just unidentified woman. She had no name in the public story. She was set decoration in the drama of her husband's life. The FBI intensified their surveillance. They didn't just watch anymore, they performed their watching. Agents sat in unmarked cars directly in front of the house, making no attempt to hide. They followed Victoria to church, to the supermarket, to her mother's apartment. Her mother, who had softened slightly since Frank's death, but still maintained careful distance from the circus her daughter's life had become. The agents sometimes approached her in parking lots with business cards and invitations to cooperate. "Mrs. Gotti, we know this must be difficult. If you ever want to talk." She took the cards and threw them away in public trash cans, where they could see her do it. The house in Howard Beach became a fortress. John installed security systems, reinforced the doors, built a fence. He swept for bugs weekly. Conversations about anything real happened outside, in the yard, in cars with the radio loud. Victoria's home stopped being a home and became operational headquarters for a criminal enterprise she was not part of but could not escape. The children's lives narrowed. Angela was 23 now, engaged to a man named Carmine Agnello who ran an auto salvage yard and was exactly the kind of connected neighborhood guy John approved of. The engagement felt less like love than strategic alliance. Angela had learned from watching her mother. Marry someone John respects, stay close to the family, never leave the neighborhood. The wedding was planned for 1984 but kept getting postponed as John's legal troubles multiplied. When they finally married in 1984, the reception was under surveillance. FBI photographing guests, running plates in the parking lot. Angela's wedding album would eventually be entered as evidence in a federal trial. Victoria Jr., now 21, was the only one who seemed to enjoy the attention. She dressed flashy, went to clubs in Manhattan, dated men John didn't approve of. The arguments between father and daughter were epic, screaming matches where Victoria Jr. accused John of hypocrisy and John accused her of disrespect. Once she brought home a man who wasn't Italian. John threw him out physically, grabbed him by the collar, and shoved him down the front steps while neighbors watched. Victoria Jr. didn't speak to her father for a month. Victoria Sr. mediated, as always, trying to keep peace in a house where peace was impossible. John Jr. was 19 and already deeper into the life than Victoria could prevent. He worked construction jobs that were covers for other work. He spent his nights at the Bergen with his father's crew. He was being groomed for succession in ways that were obvious to everyone. Victoria watched her son become a version of his father. The same swagger, the same need for respect, the same inability to imagine a life outside the structure of the family. She wanted to tell him to run, to go to college, to become anything else. But she knew he'd never listen, and she knew John would never forgive her for trying. Peter, 11 years old, was the one she worried about most. He was sensitive in ways the family didn't value. He cried easily. He hated confrontation. John called him soft, tried to toughen him up through criticism and mockery that made the boy shrink further into himself. Victoria defended him when she could, but her defenses only made John angrier. "You're ruining him," John said, and Victoria stopped defending Peter where his father could see, which meant the boy learned that even his mother's protection was conditional. The money was immense now. John controlled construction, waste management, trucking, unions. Cash came into the house in amounts Victoria couldn't track. She had credit cards she never asked for and didn't want. John bought her jewelry she didn't wear, furs she kept in the closet, a Cadillac she was afraid to drive because it felt like driving evidence. The wealth was obscene and impossible to enjoy because every dollar felt like a target on their backs. Christmas 1986 was a spectacle. John insisted on the biggest tree, the most lights, presents stacked so high the children couldn't see over them. Neighbors came by to admire the display. News crews filmed the house from the street. Victoria cooked for days, 7 fishes on Christmas Eve, a feast on Christmas Day. The house was full of John's crew and their families, everyone eating and drinking and celebrating the boss. John held court in the living room, drinking scotch, telling stories, accepting tributes and envelopes of cash wrapped in holiday paper. Victoria moved through the party serving food, refilling drinks, and feeling like help at someone else's event. Her children were there but scattered. Angela with her husband, Victoria Jr. Upstairs on the phone, John Jr. in the corner with the younger guys from the crew, Peter sitting alone near the tree looking overwhelmed. They were a family for the cameras and the neighbors, but privately they were 5 separate people orbiting a man who required their presence but not their actual selves. In early 1987, John was indicted on racketeering charges. It wasn't his first indictment and wouldn't be his last, but this one felt different. The prosecutors had wiretaps, surveillance footage, cooperating witnesses. They had built a case that looked solid. John's lawyers were confident anyway. They were always confident, and John himself seemed energized by it, like the trial was just another stage to perform on. The trial started in August. Victoria attended every day, sitting in the front row behind the defense table where cameras could see her. She wore conservative dresses, kept her expression neutral, performed the role of loyal wife. The prosecution presented tapes of John's voice discussing murders, extortion, loan sharking. They played the tapes in open court, John's words echoing through the room. Victoria listened to her husband order violence with the same casual tone he used to order dinner, and she felt nothing. She'd stopped being shocked years ago. The media loved it. Reporters filled the courthouse, writing breathless accounts of the Dapper Don's trial, profiling John like he was a celebrity rather than a criminal. Victoria appeared in these stories only as decoration. His wife Victoria sat stoically, or Mrs. Gotti showed no reaction. She was a prop in the theater of his prosecution. John was acquitted in March 1987. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Outside the courthouse, John celebrated like he'd won the Super Bowl, arms raised, smiling for every camera. Victoria stood beside him, and the photos from that day show her half a step back, not quite smiling, already bracing for what came next. What came next was vindication in John's mind, an escalation in reality. He believed he was untouchable now, that he'd beaten the government and could beat them again. He got flashier, louder, more public. He held a 4th of July party in 1987 that shut down the entire block. Fireworks, live music, hundreds of people. It was less a party than a demonstration of power, and Victoria walked through it feeling like she was attending her own public execution. The FBI responded by increasing pressure. More surveillance, more indictments, more pressure on everyone connected to John. Associates started getting arrested. Some started cooperating. The walls were closing in, but John couldn't see it or wouldn't acknowledge it. He was the boss. He was untouchable. He'd beaten them before, and he'd beat them again. Victoria could see what he couldn't. She'd learned to read power shifts through years of watching men posture and defer. And what she saw in 1988 was the beginning of the end. The government was patient. They were building cases that wouldn't fail. They were flipping witnesses who could testify to everything. And John, drunk on his own legend, was giving them everything they needed. In December 1988, John Jr. was formally inducted into the Gambino family. He was 24 years old. John Sr. hosted a celebration at the house that felt like a coronation. Victoria watched her son take the same oath her husband had taken, binding himself to the same life, the same loyalty structure, the same inevitable trajectory toward prison or death. She wanted to scream. She wanted to grab her son and run. Instead, she served food and accepted congratulations from people who thought she should be proud. That night, after everyone left, she went into Frank's room. It had been 8 years since his death, and the room still looked exactly the same. She sat on the bed and looked at the posters on the wall and thought about the child she'd buried and the child she'd just lost in a different way. Both sons gone, one to an accident and another to his father's ambition. She didn't cry. She'd learned years ago that crying changed nothing. She sat in the dark room and listened to John downstairs watching television, laughing at something, comfortable in his power, and she understood with absolute clarity that she had become a ghost in her own life, present but not visible, necessary but not valued, married but utterly alone. The house was worth millions. The cars were expensive. The jewelry was real. And Victoria would have traded all of it for a single day when someone asked what she wanted, what she thought, what she felt. But no one asked. No one had asked in so long that she wasn't sure she knew the answers anymore. The mansion on 85th Street sat behind an 8-foot fence with security cameras mounted at every corner. Victoria had lived there for a decade, but it had never stopped feeling like someone else's house. The rooms were too large, the ceilings too high. Her voice echoed when she called for the children. The marble floors made every footstep sound like an announcement. John had chosen everything. The location in Howard Beach because it was his territory, his neighborhood, his kingdom. The size because it needed to communicate status. The decor, heavy furniture, ornate chandeliers, gold fixtures, because this was what successful men had. Victoria's only contribution was making it clean. She employed no staff. John didn't trust outsiders in the house, and Victoria had learned that doing the work herself was easier than fighting about it. She cleaned a 6-bedroom house alone, scrubbed bathrooms no one used, polished furniture in rooms no one sat in except when company came. The work was endless and pointless, but it gave her something to do with her hands while her mind went elsewhere. She'd be vacuuming the living room and realize an hour had passed and she couldn't remember any of it. Dissociation had become her default state. The kitchen was the only room that felt like hers. She cooked there every day. Enormous meals even when John wasn't home to eat them. Pasta, meat, vegetables, desserts. The cooking was compulsive, a way to fill time and create the appearance of normalcy. The children came home to hot food. It meant something. It had to mean something. But the children came home less now. Angela had her own house with Carmine, 3 sons to raise in the same world. Victoria had raised her children. She visited dutifully but kept her distance, like she'd learned that proximity to her mother meant proximity to pain she couldn't afford. Victoria Jr. was in and out, always fighting with John about something, using the house like a hotel. John Jr. had an apartment in Queens but spent most nights at the Ravenite with his father. Peter, now 14, was the only one still living at home full-time, and he spent most of his time in his room avoiding everyone. The house was full of things and empty of people. Victoria walked through it and felt like a caretaker in a museum dedicated to someone else's life. The photographs on the walls showed a family that didn't exist. Everyone smiling, everyone together. In reality, they were scattered, isolated, performing connection only when required. John was home less and less. The Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy had become his real residence. He held court there every day, ran the family business from a table in the back, and came home only when he needed to sleep or wanted to remind Victoria he still existed. When he was home, he was distant. He'd eat dinner in silence, watch television, fall asleep on the couch. They hadn't had a real conversation in years. They'd had sex maybe twice in the past 5 years, quick and mechanical, him taking what he needed and rolling over. Victoria had stopped expecting anything else. She'd gained weight, not dramatically, but enough that her clothes fit differently, that she avoided mirrors, that she felt her body as a betrayal. John noticed and commented. "You're letting yourself go," he said once, and Victoria had nodded like it was helpful feedback rather than cruelty. She'd tried dieting, lost 10 pounds, gained them back. The weight felt like armor or evidence of giving up. She couldn't decide which. The other wives still existed on the periphery of her life. She saw them at weddings, funerals, christenings. They kissed her cheek and asked about the children and never said anything real. Victoria didn't blame them. She was the boss's wife now, which meant she was either to be envied or feared, but never befriended. The isolation was total. Her mother had died in 1987, a heart attack, sudden and fatal. Victoria found out from her brother, a man she barely spoke to anymore. She'd gone to the funeral and felt nothing. Her mother had been disappointed in her for 25 years, and death hadn't changed that. Victoria stood at the grave and thought about how they'd both made the same mistake, married men who consumed them, and neither had figured out how to escape. The house had a room that was supposed to be Victoria's, a sitting room with a desk and bookshelves. She never used it. She couldn't remember the last time she'd read a book. She'd had interests once, she thought. Music, maybe. She'd liked to dance when she was young, but those versions of herself were so distant, they felt fictional. She was Victoria Gotti now, mother, wife, keeper of the house. That was the entire definition. In 1989, John threw a Christmas party that cost more than most people made in a year. The house was decorated like a department store display. Lights on every surface, garland wrapped around railings, 3 Christmas trees. Caterers prepared food for 300 people. A band played in the living room. Neighbors stood outside the fence to watch people arrive. The FBI filmed everything. Victoria spent the party in the kitchen making sure there was enough food, that everything was perfect. She wore a red dress John had bought her without consulting her size or taste. It was too tight and made her feel like she was performing femininity for an audience that wasn't interested. She smiled until her face hurt and accepted compliments about the house, the food, the party, none of which were about her, but about what she could provide. John held court in the center of everything, surrounded by his crew, by politicians who pretended they didn't know what he was, by celebrities who wanted proximity to danger. He was charming and expansive, telling stories, making people laugh. Victoria watched from the kitchen doorway and recognized him as someone she'd once thought she knew. That person, or her understanding of that person, was long gone. Late in the party, a reporter somehow got past security. He approached Victoria near the buffet table with a camera crew. "Mrs. Gotti, how does it feel to be married to the most powerful mobster in America?" Victoria stared at him. Someone from the crew intervened and escorted the reporter out. But the question lingered. How did it feel? She had no answer. She couldn't remember feeling anything in so long that the concept seemed abstract. After everyone left, Victoria cleaned. It took hours. John went to bed without helping. The children had scattered to their own lives. She was alone with garbage bags and dirty plates and a house that would never be clean enough. At 3 in the morning, she sat on the kitchen floor and stared at the marble tiles and thought about how expensive everything was and how worthless it all felt. The money kept coming, but it came with strings. Every purchase was tracked by federal agents building cases. Victoria learned to pay for everything in cash, to avoid paper trails, to keep no records. She had bank accounts she didn't know about, assets in other people's names, investments she didn't understand. John handled all of it. When she asked questions, he told her not to worry about it. "I take care of everything," he said, and the reassurance felt like another form of control. She had no money of her own. Everything came through John. If she wanted something, she had to ask. He was generous with certain things, clothes, jewelry, the house, but she had no independence, no ability to make financial decisions. She was 50 years old and couldn't write a check without permission. In 1990, the FBI raided the Ravenite and arrested John on new charges: murder, conspiracy, racketeering. It was the beginning of the case that would finally stick. Victoria knew it before the lawyers said it. She could feel the inevitability. John's luck was running out. The government had tapes, witnesses, evidence. This time would be different. John was released on bail and returned home like nothing had happened. He was confident, dismissive of the charges. "They have nothing," he said. Victoria didn't argue. She'd learned that arguing with John's delusions was pointless. He believed what he needed to believe. The house became a prison of waiting. Waiting for the trial, waiting for the verdict, waiting for the life they had to end, and whatever came after to begin. Victoria moved through days that felt identical. Cook, clean, wait. The children visited less. Angela was busy with her own sons. Victoria Jr. was starting to talk about writing a book, using the family story for her own purposes. John Jr. was facing his own charges. Peter was in high school and barely spoke to anyone. Victoria stood in the center of her enormous house and felt its emptiness like a physical presence. 6 bedrooms, and she slept alone. A dining room that could seat 12, and she ate by herself. A living room filled with expensive furniture no one sat on. She'd spent her entire adult life building a home, and what she'd built was a mausoleum. At night, she walked through the rooms and turned off lights. The house was darker empty than full. She'd passed Frank's old room, finally converted into storage after 15 years, but still somehow his, and feel the weight of all the losses stacked on top of each other. The son who died, the husband who'd never really been present, the children who'd learned to leave her before she could leave them. The versions of herself she'd buried to become what was required. She went to bed in a room that smelled of John's cologne, even when he wasn't there. The scent had soaked into the walls, the sheets, her skin. She couldn't escape it. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what she'd wanted when she was 19 and met a man who'd seemed like certainty. She couldn't remember. that girl was gone. And Victoria, 50 years old, 50 pounds heavier, exhausted down to her bones, didn't know who she'd become in that girl's place. The verdict came on April 2nd, 1992. Guilty on all counts. 13 charges including murder, conspiracy, racketeering, obstruction of justice. Victoria sat in the courtroom and watched the jury foreman read the word guilty 13 times. John showed no reaction. He'd been coached by his lawyers to remain stoic. Victoria had no such coaching. She felt her face doing something, collapsing or freezing. She couldn't tell which. Cameras caught it. The image appeared in newspapers the next day. Gotti's wife reacts to verdict. John was sentenced to life without possibility of parole. The judge called him a danger to society, said he'd shown no remorse, deserved no leniency. John stood and took it like he was receiving an award. Afterward, being led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Victoria once. She couldn't read his expression. Pride, maybe, or defiance. Not sadness. Never that. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Maximum security, 23-hour lockdown, 1 hour of recreation alone in a cage, no contact with other prisoners. The Bureau of Prisons had determined that John Gotti, even in prison, was too dangerous to be allowed normal interaction. Victoria received this information through lawyers. The prison was 790 miles from Howard Beach, 13 hours by car. She made the drive for the first time in June 1992, alone, because John didn't want the children to see him in prison. She drove through the night, stopped once for gas and coffee, and arrived at Marion in the morning disoriented and exhausted. The prison was surrounded by fences topped with razor wire, guard towers at every corner. The building itself was concrete and small windows. It looked like what it was, a place designed to erase people. The visiting process took 2 hours. Forms, searches, metal detectors. They searched her purse, her person. She was patted down by a female guard who was thorough to the point of humiliation. She understood it was intentional, part of the punishment extending to families. She submitted without protest because protest would mean being denied the visit. The visiting room was small and cold, plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a table between her and John, guards watching from all sides. John was brought in wearing prison khakis, his hair still perfect somehow, his posture unchanged. He sat down and looked at her like he was sitting down to dinner. They were allowed to embrace briefly at the beginning and end of the visit. 2 seconds, the guard said. Victoria stood and hugged her husband and felt his body, thinner now, harder, and smelled the institutional soap that had replaced his cologne. Then she sat back down and they talked across a table under fluorescent lights with a guard listening to every word. John talked about his appeal. The lawyers were confident, he said. The conviction would be overturned. There were errors in the trial, problems with the evidence. He'd be home in 2 years, maybe 3. Victoria nodded and said nothing about the fact that she'd heard identical promises before every previous trial. She'd learned that her job during visits was to agree, to reassure, to maintain his morale. Her own feelings were irrelevant. He asked about the house, about the children, about money. She gave him updates carefully worded to sound positive. Angela was good. The grandchildren were growing. Victoria Jr. was working on her book. This made John angry. He called his daughter disloyal for profiting from the family name, and Victoria steered the conversation elsewhere. John Jr. was handling business. Peter was in school. The house was fine. Everything was fine. Nothing was fine. Angela's husband Carmine was facing charges of his own. Victoria Jr. was dating men John would hate if he knew about them. John Jr. was being investigated by the FBI. Peter was failing classes and spending all his time alone in his room. The house was falling apart. The roof leaked, the furnace was broken. There were repairs Victoria didn't know how to arrange or pay for. But she told John everything was fine because telling him the truth would accomplish nothing except making him feel powerless, and his powerlessness always somehow became her fault. The visit lasted 2 hours. At the end, they stood and embraced again. 2 seconds. Then John was led away through a door that locked behind him, with a sound Victoria would hear in her sleep for years. She walked back to her car and sat in the parking lot and stared at the prison and wondered how she would do this every week for the rest of her life. But she did. Every week, she made the drive. 13 hours there, 2 hours visiting, 13 hours back. 28 hours of her life consumed by maintaining her husband's connection to a world he could no longer control. She drove through every season, through snow and heat, through exhaustion and illness. She missed grandchildren's birthdays, doctor's appointments, her own life. The drives became automatic. She'd arrive at the prison and not remember the journey. The visits developed a rhythm. John talked. Victoria listened. He gave orders about the family, about business he wasn't supposed to be running from prison but was anyway. Victoria took mental notes because writing anything down was forbidden. She'd drive home and relay messages to John Jr., to the lawyers, to people whose names she didn't know and didn't want to know. She was a courier between prison and the world, valuable only for her ability to carry information. Other wives visited their husbands on the same days. Victoria saw them in the parking lot, in the waiting room. They never acknowledged each other beyond brief nods. Some strange code of conduct suggested that admitting they were all living the same nightmare would make it more real. So they pretended they didn't see each other, and Victoria drove home alone every week, feeling like she was the only person in the world living this particular hell. The house in Howard Beach became even emptier. The children visited less frequently. They had their own lives, their own problems. Victoria understood. She'd raised them to survive, and survival meant distance. Angela called once a week out of duty. Victoria Jr. called when she needed something. John Jr. came by to discuss business Victoria didn't want to hear about. Peter avoided her entirely, the way teenagers avoid parents who make them feel guilty for existing. Victoria filled the time between visits with compulsive domesticity. She cleaned the house obsessively, reorganized closets, made elaborate meals she ate alone. The cooking had become pathological. 3-course dinners for one person, enough food to feed a family that no longer lived there. She'd freeze the leftovers, and the freezer filled with containers of food that would never be eaten. The money situation grew worse. John's assets had been seized. The lawyers were expensive. The house was expensive. Victoria had cash John had hidden before his arrest, but it was running out. She'd never paid bills before, never managed money. She was learning at 52 years old how to budget, how to prioritize, how to tell people she couldn't pay them. The humiliation was constant. In 1993, John Jr. was indicted. 29 years old, following his father's path exactly. Victoria sat in another courtroom, watching another trial, another performance of Gotti men versus the government. John Jr. was acquitted that time, but more charges would come. She could see the pattern repeating, generation to generation, and she had no power to stop it. She visited John Sr. the week after John Jr.'s trial. She told him his son had been acquitted. John was pleased in a distant way, like hearing about a sports team he'd once cared about. Then he talked about his own appeal, which had been denied, and denied again. The Supreme Court had refused to hear the case. John dismissed this as temporary setback. "We'll find another angle," he said. Victoria nodded. The delusion was essential to him. She wouldn't take it away. By 1994, the visits had become a kind of death. Victoria would sit across from John and feel nothing. She'd stopped hoping he'd ask about her life, about how she was managing. The conversations were entirely about him, his conditions, his appeals, his legacy, his instructions for the family. She was there to receive and transmit. Her interiority had ceased to interest him, if it ever had. She gained more weight, 50 pounds over what she'd weighed when John went to prison. She stopped trying to lose it. What was the point? Who was she maintaining her appearance for? She wore loose clothes and avoided mirrors and accepted her body as evidence of giving up. The drives became dangerous. She'd fall asleep at the wheel and wake up drifting into another lane. Once she ran off the road completely, woke up on the shoulder with her heart pounding. She kept driving. What else was there to do? Stop visiting? That wasn't an option. John expected her. The family expected her. She expected it of herself. In 1996, John was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado. A DX Florence, the supermax prison where they kept terrorists and serial killers. Solitary confinement in a cell smaller than a parking space. No human contact. Meals through a slot in the door. The transfer was punishment for continuing to run the Gambino family from prison. Victoria learned about it through the news. Colorado was farther. The visits became less frequent, once a month instead of once a week. The visiting conditions were worse, more security, more restrictions, less time. She'd fly now instead of drive, spend money they didn't have on plane tickets to spend 2 hours in a concrete room with a man who barely looked at her. The visits in Florence were worse in ways Victoria couldn't articulate. The prison was designed to break people. John was being broken. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he'd lost weight, in the tremor in his hands. He was getting old. They both were. He'd be 60 by the year 2000. She'd be 58. They'd spent their entire adult lives preparing for his success, and success had delivered them here. Him in a cage in Colorado, her in an empty house in Howard Beach, both of them prisoners of different kinds. She sat across from him in 1997 and heard him talk about appeals that would never succeed, about getting out of prison that would never happen, about the future that didn't exist. And she nodded and agreed and played her role. Because this was her life. This was what she'd agreed to when she was 19 and stupid and believed that loving a certain kind of man would make her matter. The visits were all she had. Without them, she had no purpose. The children were grown and gone. The house was just a building. Her entire identity had been constructed around being John Gotti's wife. And now being John Gotti's wife meant driving or flying across the country to spend 2 hours being ignored in a visiting room in a supermax prison. She kept visiting. What else was there? Victoria Jr. published her first book in 1997. Women and mitral valve prolapse had nothing to do with the family, nothing to do with crime. It was about a heart condition Victoria Jr. claimed to have, written with the earnestness of someone trying to establish credibility in a world that would always see her only as a mobster's daughter. The book sold poorly. Victoria Sr. bought 10 copies and never read any of them. The second book came in 1999. The Senator's Daughter was a novel, thinly veiled fiction about a girl from a crime family trying to live a normal life. John read about it in prison and called Victoria Sr. in a rage. "She's capitalizing on my name," he said. "She's selling us out." Victoria Sr. tried to defend their daughter, tried to explain that the girl was just trying to build something of her own. John wasn't interested in explanations. "Tell her to stop," he said. Victoria Sr. called Victoria Jr. and relayed the message. Victoria Jr. hung up on her. The relationship between mother and daughter had been deteriorating for years. Victoria Jr. blamed her mother for enabling her father, for never standing up to him, for teaching her daughters that men like John Gotti were acceptable. Victoria Sr. blamed Victoria Jr. for not understanding the impossible position she'd been in, for judging decisions made under circumstances the daughter had never faced. They spoke in careful, hostile tones. Each conversation felt like a negotiation between enemies. In 2000, Victoria Jr. sold a reality show concept to A&E. Growing Up Gotti would document her life as a single mother, raising 3 sons, Carmine, John, and Frank, in a mansion on Long Island. The mansion had been purchased with money from somewhere. Victoria Sr. didn't ask where. The show would premiere in 2004, but the preparations began years earlier. Cameras, producers, a manufactured version of Gotti family life, presented for entertainment. John hated it. From his cell in Florence, he raged about his daughter turning the family into a circus. Victoria Sr. visited him in 2001 and absorbed his anger. "She's making us look like clowns," he said. "She's disrespecting everything I built." Victoria Sr. didn't point out that what he'd built was currently a life sentence in solitary confinement. She nodded and agreed and promised to talk to Victoria Jr., knowing the conversation would accomplish nothing. She called her daughter from a payphone outside the prison. Victoria Jr. answered on the 5th ring, impatient already. "What does he want now?" "He wants you to stop the show." "I don't care what he wants. He's in prison. He doesn't get a vote anymore." Victoria Sr. tried a different approach. "This will bring more attention to the family. The FBI already knows everything about us. This doesn't change that. What it changes is me being broke and trying to raise 3 kids with no help from anyone. The accusation hung between them. No help from anyone meant no help from Victoria Sr., who had no money to give, no resources to share. She'd been sending what she could to all her children, small amounts that wouldn't be noticed by the authorities monitoring her accounts. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. I just think, Victoria Sr. started. You don't think. You do what he tells you. You've been doing what he tells you for 40 years. Don't call me with his messages anymore. I'm done. Victoria Jr. hung up. Victoria Sr. stood in the parking lot of ADX Florence, holding a dead phone and feeling the familiar sensation of being caught between irreconcilable demands. John wanted control he no longer had. Victoria Jr. wanted freedom from a family that would never let her go. And Victoria Sr. was the messenger between them, valued only for her ability to absorb their anger. Growing Up Gotti premiered in August 2004. Victoria Sr. watched the first episode alone in Howard Beach. The show was absurd, Victoria Jr., and her 3 teenage sons living in a mansion dealing with typical reality TV drama elevated by the Gotti name. The sons were presented as spoiled, entitled, obsessed with their hair and clothes. Victoria Jr. played the tough but loving single mother, name-dropping her father occasionally, but keeping the actual criminality at arm's length. It was sanitized, commercialized, a version of the Gotti family stripped of darkness and repackaged as entertainment. Victoria Sr. watched her daughter on television and recognized the performance, the careful construction of a persona designed to profit from the name while denying the reality. She'd done something similar for 40 years. The difference was Victoria Jr. was getting paid. The show ran for 3 seasons, 41 episodes of Victoria Jr. and her sons navigating life in Long Island, dealing with paparazzi, going to parties, fighting over cars and clothes. It was popular enough to spawn articles, interviews, Victoria Jr. becoming a minor celebrity. She appeared on talk shows, gave quotes to magazines, built a brand around being a Gotti without being a criminal. John died before the show finished its run. In 2002, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. The Bureau of Prisons refused to release him for treatment. He remained in his cell at ADX Florence while the cancer spread. Victoria Sr. was allowed special visits toward the end. She flew to Colorado once a month and sat with her husband in a room with medical equipment and guards and no privacy. John was dying the way he'd lived, stubborn, angry, refusing to show weakness. He'd lost 60 pounds. His skin was gray. He could barely speak through the tumor in his throat, but he still gave orders, still dictated terms, still acted like he controlled something. Victoria Sr. sat beside him and held his hand and felt nothing. She'd expected to feel something, grief, relief, anger, love, but there was just emptiness. He died on June 10, 2002 in a prison hospital, 61 years old. Victoria was notified by a phone call from a Bureau of Prisons official who read from a script and offered condolences that sounded like legal liability protection. She hung up and sat in the kitchen and waited to feel something. Still nothing. The funeral was a spectacle. Hundreds of people, news crews, FBI agents photographing mourners. John was buried in St. John Cemetery in Queens, the same cemetery where Carlo Gambino and other Gambino bosses were buried. The headstone was granite and expensive. Victoria stood at the grave and accepted condolences from people she barely knew and didn't like. Angela stood beside her, silent. Victoria Jr. showed up late and left early. John Jr. was stoic in a way that looked exactly like his father. Peter didn't attend. He called the morning of the funeral and said he couldn't do it. Victoria didn't push. After the funeral, there was a gathering at a restaurant John had liked. More people, more condolences, more performance of grief. Victoria sat at a table and watched her family scatter through the room. Angela with her sons, already teaching them the same gestures and codes. Victoria Jr. with a producer from her show, talking about something Victoria couldn't hear. John Jr. surrounded by young men from his father's old crew. Accepting tributes like succession was already decided. She went home alone. The house was dark and empty. She walked through rooms that still smelled like John's cologne, even though he'd been gone for 10 years. She went into the bedroom and looked at the closet still full of his suits. She should probably get rid of them. But who would she give them to? And what would it mean to erase the physical evidence of him when he'd already consumed her entire life? She left the suits hanging there. She slept on her side of the bed, even though the whole bed was hers now. She woke up in the middle of the night and reached for him before remembering he was dead. The habit of his presence was stronger than the reality of his absence. Victoria Jr. called a week after the funeral. "I'm writing a book about Dad. I thought you should know." "What kind of book?" "A memoir, my experience growing up as his daughter, the good and the bad." Victoria Sr. knew what that meant. The bad would be John's violence, his absence, his criminality. The good would be sanitized anecdotes about family dinners and Christmas presents. He just died. Which is why now is the time. People want to know about him. I might as well be the one to tell them. "You're going to profit from this?" "Yes, I am. Just like you profited from being his wife for 40 years. At least I'm honest about it." The accusation landed. Victoria Sr. had profited. The house, the money, the status. She'd taken all of it without acknowledging the price. And now her daughter was taking the story and selling it to anyone who would pay. Neither of them had clean hands. This Is My Story was published in 2009. Victoria Sr. didn't read it. She heard about it from people who called to tell her what Victoria Jr. had written. Stories about John's violence toward his children, his infidelities, his paranoia, and stories about Victoria Sr. too, the enabling mother who never protected her children from their father's rage, the woman who chose her marriage over her kids. Victoria Sr. didn't defend herself. What would be the point? Victoria Jr. wasn't entirely wrong. She had chosen John. Every day for 40 years, she'd chosen him. Not because she loved him. She wasn't sure she'd ever loved him, or if what she'd felt was love or just the need to be chosen, but because leaving was impossible, unthinkable. Because her entire identity was built on being his wife, and without that, she was nothing. The book sold moderately well. Victoria Jr. did interviews. She talked about breaking free from her father's legacy while simultaneously profiting from it. The contradiction didn't seem to bother her. She was building a career from the rubble of the family, and Victoria Sr. understood it as both betrayal and survival. Maybe they were the same thing. They didn't speak for 3 years after the book came out. When they finally did, it was at Angela's granddaughter's christening. They stood on opposite sides of the church and made eye contact once. Victoria Jr. looked away first. Victoria Sr. understood it as victory and defeat simultaneously. She'd won the staring contest, but lost her daughter years ago. The first call came in November 2001. A doctor from the Federal Bureau of Prisons Medical Center called Victoria at home and told her that John had a mass in his throat. They were running tests. She should expect more information within a week. The doctor's tone was clinical, procedural. He was notifying next of kin as required by regulation. Nothing about his delivery suggested he cared whether John Gotti lived or died. Victoria hung up and sat at the kitchen table and tried to feel something. Fear, maybe. Grief. Instead, she felt a distant curiosity about what would happen next. John had survived everything. Arrests, trials, prison, enemies. Cancer seemed anticlimactic, but also inevitable. Men like John didn't retire. They didn't fade peacefully. They died violently, or they died in cages. John was dying in a cage. The diagnosis was confirmed in December: squamous cell carcinoma of the throat. Stage 4. The cancer had already spread to his lymph nodes. Treatment options were limited in a supermax prison. Surgery would require transfer to a medical facility. Radiation might be possible on site. Chemotherapy would depend on security clearances and medical staff availability. The doctors presented these options like menu items. Victoria listened on a monitored prison phone line and understood that the Bureau of Prisons had no investment in keeping John Gotti alive. John's lawyers filed motions for compassionate release. The argument was simple. He was dying. He posed no threat. Let him die at home. The prosecutors opposed it with equal simplicity. He'd murdered people. run a criminal empire from prison, deserved no compassion. The judge denied the motion in January 2002. John would die in federal custody. Victoria flew to Colorado in February. The special visit was granted because of his medical condition. She sat across from John in a sterile medical room that smelled of disinfectant and something else. Decay, maybe, or just hopelessness. John looked smaller. The cancer had already taken weight from him. His skin had a yellow tint, but his eyes were still sharp, still angry. "They're trying to kill me," he said. His voice was raspy, damaged by the tumor pressing against his vocal cords. "The doctors are trying to treat you," Victoria said. "The doctors work for them, the government. They want me dead." Victoria didn't argue. Maybe he was right. Maybe the slow medical response, the denied releases, the minimal treatment were all forms of murder dressed up as procedure. Or maybe John's paranoia had calcified into permanent delusion. Either way, arguing accomplished nothing. He talked about fighting, about beating this the way he'd beaten everything else, about getting out and making the people who'd done this to him pay. Victoria nodded and agreed and knew he was lying to himself. The cancer was going to kill him. The only question was how long it would take and how much he would suffer. She visited monthly through the spring. Each visit, John was visibly worse, more weight gone, voice weaker, but the anger never diminished. He raged about the prosecutors, the judges, the prison officials. He dictated messages to be passed to his lawyers, to John Jr., to people in the family. Victoria took mental notes and tried not to look at the way his hands shook. In April, John was transferred to the prison's medical wing. The conditions were slightly better, a hospital bed instead of a concrete bunk, more frequent medical checks. But he was still in custody, still in isolation, still dying in a cage. Victoria's visits now happened in a room with medical equipment and nurses who monitored him constantly. Every conversation was witnessed by staff. There was no privacy, even in death. The cancer moved to his brain in May. The doctors explained it in technical language: metastatic spread, neurological involvement, declining cognitive function. What it meant in practice was that John was forgetting things. He'd repeat himself. He'd forget Victoria's name sometimes. He'd talk to people who weren't there: his mother, his father, Carlo Gambino. The conversations with the dead were more coherent than his conversations with the living. Victoria sat beside his bed and held his hand and watched her husband disappear in increments. The man who'd controlled everything, who demanded absolute loyalty and obedience, was reduced to confusion and pain. There should have been satisfaction in it. Karma, justice, proof that violence and cruelty eventually consumed their perpetrators. But Victoria felt only exhaustion. She'd spent 40 years orbiting this man, and watching him die was just another obligation she couldn't escape. The lawyers made another push for compassionate release in early June. John had weeks left, maybe days. The prosecutors still opposed. The judge still denied. John Gotti would die in federal custody. That was the final message the government wanted to send. No one was too powerful to be held accountable, and accountability meant dying alone in a prison hospital. Except John wasn't alone. Victoria was there. Not because she loved him. She'd stopped loving him years ago, if she'd ever loved him at all. But because leaving a dying man, even a man who'd caused her nothing but pain, felt like a cruelty she couldn't commit. So she flew to Colorado and sat beside his bed and performed the role of grieving wife one last time. Angela came once. She flew out with her husband Carmine and sat with her father for an hour. John barely recognized her. He called her by Victoria Jr.'s name, then by his mother's name. Angela cried quietly and left. She told Victoria Sr. on the way out, "I don't know why I came. He was never really my father anyway." Victoria Sr. said nothing. What could she say? Angela was right. Victoria Jr. didn't come. She sent flowers to the hospital with a card that said, "Thinking of you." John never saw them. The prison confiscated them for security reasons. Flowers could hide contraband. Victoria Sr. took the card and put it in her purse and felt the gesture as perfectly symbolic of her daughter's relationship with her father. Present, but not present. Acknowledged, but at a distance. John Jr. came twice. He sat with his father and talked about business, about the family, about what would happen after. John Sr. gave orders even from the hospital bed. even with brain cancer eating his memory. John Jr. took notes and nodded and looked exactly like his father had 30 years earlier. The cycle was repeating. Victoria Sr. watched it happen and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change anything. Peter didn't come. He called Victoria Sr. at the hotel and said he couldn't. "I don't want to remember him like that," he said. Victoria Sr. told him it was okay, but it wasn't. Peter's absence felt like abandonment of his father, of the family, of his obligation to witness what they all were. But she understood it too. Peter was the only one who'd managed to escape. Staying away from the deathbed was just another form of escape. John died on June 10, 2002, at 12:45 p.m. Victoria was in the hotel room when the call came. She'd been at the hospital all morning, but they'd sent her away while they ran tests. By the time she got the call saying to come back, he was already dead. She arrived at the hospital and was escorted to a room where John's body lay covered with a sheet. A guard stood by the door. Even in death, John Gotti required surveillance. Victoria looked at the covered shape on the bed and felt nothing. No grief, no relief, no closure, just the dull acknowledgement that a thing was over. She'd been married to this man for 40 years. They'd had 5 children. They'd built a life together, or what passed for a life. And now he was dead, and she felt nothing. The Bureau of Prisons released the body to a funeral home in New York. The logistics took 3 days. Forms, permissions, security clearances. Victoria flew back to Howard Beach and arranged the funeral. She chose the casket, the flowers, the music. She did it alone because this was what she did, manage the family's public presentation, even when the family had nothing left to present. The funeral was scheduled for June 15th. In the days between John's death and burial, Victoria moved through the house like a ghost. She cleaned compulsively. She made food no one ate. She answered phone calls from people offering condolences she didn't want. At night, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what she was supposed to feel. The morning of the funeral, she stood in front of the closet and looked at her clothes. Black dress, black shoes, black coat. The uniform of widowhood. She put it on and looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman she barely recognized. 60 years old, overweight, gray hair she'd stopped coloring years ago, lines on her face from decades of tension and unhappiness. This was what 40 years of marriage to John Gotti had produced, a stranger in her own reflection. The funeral was exactly what she'd expected. Hundreds of people, news cameras, FBI agents. The church was full. People she'd never met offered condolences. They talked about John like he was a hero, a martyr, a victim of government overreach. No one mentioned the people he'd killed. No one mentioned the lives he'd destroyed. The mythology was complete. John Gotti, the last of the real gangsters, persecuted by a corrupt system. Victoria stood beside the casket and accepted handshakes and embraces and said, "Thank you," over and over until the words lost meaning. Her children stood with her, a united front for the cameras. Angela, silent and composed. Victoria Jr., there but distant. John Jr., accepting condolences like a new boss at his coronation. Peter, who'd shown up after all, looking like he wanted to disappear. At the cemetery, they lowered John into the ground. The priest said prayers. People threw flowers on the casket. Victoria stood at the edge of the grave and watched the box disappear into the earth and thought about how much space one man's body took up and how much more space his absence would take in the years to come. The house felt different after the funeral. Not emptier. It had been empty for years, but different in its emptiness. Before, John's absence had been temporary, conditional on visiting schedules and phone calls. Now the absence was permanent. Victoria walked through rooms that would never contain him again and couldn't decide if this was freedom or just a different kind of imprisonment. The first month, she waited for relief that never came. People told her she could start over now, build a new life, do things she'd always wanted to do. But Victoria couldn't remember what she'd ever wanted. Her entire adult life had been organized around John's needs, John's schedule, John's demands. Without him, there was just empty space where her own desires should have been. She kept his closet intact. The suits still hung there, protected in plastic. His shoes were lined up on the floor. His watches were in a drawer. She told herself she'd sort through it eventually, donate the clothes, sell the jewelry. But months passed and she did nothing. The closet became a shrine she visited when she couldn't sleep, standing in front of his clothes at 3 in the morning, trying to remember if she'd ever been happy. Money became a serious problem. John's assets had been seized years ago. The house was paid off, but there were taxes, utilities, maintenance. The roof still leaked. The furnace needed replacing. Victoria had some cash left from before John's arrest, but it was running out. She'd never worked, never had her own income. At 60 years old, she had no job skills, no resume, no way to support herself beyond selling things. She started selling jewelry first, pieces John had bought her over the years. Diamond earrings, gold bracelets, a necklace she'd worn once and hated. She took them to a pawn shop in Queens and accepted whatever they offered. The man behind the counter knew who she was. Everyone in Queens knew who she was. He gave her slightly more than the jewelry was worth, either out of respect or pity. Victoria took the cash and didn't ask which. The children offered money sporadically. Angela would slip her a few $100s when she visited. Victoria Jr. sent checks irregularly, always with notes implying this was charity and Victoria Sr. should be grateful. John Jr. contributed when he could, but he had legal bills of his own, multiple trials, appeals, lawyers' fees. Peter sent nothing because he had nothing to send. By 2003, Victoria was selling furniture. The dining room table that sat 12 went first, then the leather couches in the living room, the bedroom set from the master bedroom. She sold them through classified ads, met strangers at the house, and watched them carry away pieces of the life she'd built. Each piece that left made the house feel more like what it actually was, a hollow monument to something that had never really existed. The neighborhood changed around her. Howard Beach was gentrifying. Young families moving in, old families dying or moving away. The new neighbors didn't know who she was or didn't care. They complained about her lawn, about the peeling paint on the house, about the fence that was falling apart. Victoria received letters from the Homeowners Association about property standards. She threw them away because she had no money to fix anything. Angela visited once a month, always on Sunday afternoons. She'd bring her grandsons, Victoria's great-grandsons, though the boys didn't call her that. They called her Mrs. Gotti, like she was a stranger. Angela had taught them to be careful about family connections, to maintain distance from the legacy. The visits were awkward and brief. Angela would make small talk about the boys' school, their sports, their lives that had nothing to do with Victoria. Then they'd leave, and Victoria would be alone again. Victoria Jr. visited less, maybe twice a year, always with cameras or excuses. She was working on another book or another TV project or another way to monetize the family name. When she came to the house, she looked around like she was scouting a location, mentally cataloging what could be used. Victoria Sr. watched her daughter calculate and understood they'd become strangers who happened to share blood. John Jr. was in and out of prison, arrested in 2004 on racketeering charges, 4 trials between 2004 and 2009, 3 mistrials, 1 acquittal. He was living his father's life on repeat, and Victoria watched it happen with the distant horror of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. She attended his trials when she could afford the travel, sat in courtrooms, performed loyalty she'd stopped feeling. Afterward, John Jr. would thank her with the same entitled assumption his father had always had, that her presence was obligation, not gift. Peter disappeared entirely for years. He'd moved to Florida or California. Victoria heard different stories from different people. He'd changed his name, or was using a different name, or was just avoiding anything connected to the family. Victoria called the last number she had for him once in 2005. A stranger answered and said no one by that name lived there. She didn't try again. If Peter wanted to be gone, she wouldn't chase him. She understood the impulse. The loneliness was total. Victoria could go days without speaking to another person. She'd talk to herself while cooking, narrating her own actions like a television host. Now we're going to brown the meat. Make sure the pan is hot. The sound of her own voice was better than silence, but barely. She gained more weight, not intentionally, just through the mechanics of depression and age and having nothing else to do but eat. She'd make pasta at 2 in the morning and eat it standing at the counter. She'd bake cookies and eat the entire batch in one sitting. Food was the only thing that still provided any comfort, and the comfort was temporary and followed by self-loathing. She avoided mirrors entirely now. In 2006, the house was burglarized. Someone broke in while she was at the grocery store and took what little jewelry remained, a television, some cash she'd hidden in the bedroom. The police came and took a report and made it clear they didn't care much about a crime against a mobster's widow. Victoria stood in her ransacked bedroom and felt violated in a way she hadn't felt in years. This had been her space, her prison maybe, but hers. And now even that had been taken. She didn't replace what was stolen. There was no money for it, and no point. The house was falling apart around her anyway. Pipes leaked, the electrical system was failing, rooms she didn't use became uninhabitable. The ceiling in one bedroom collapsed from water damage, and Victoria just closed the door and stopped going in there. The isolation did something to her mind. She'd have conversations with John sometimes, full arguments conducted with an empty chair. She'd yell at him about money, about the children, about 40 years of being ignored. The chair never answered, but the arguments felt real enough that afterward she'd be exhausted, shaking, crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry when he was alive. She started having health problems, high blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis that made it painful to move. She couldn't afford regular doctor visits. She'd go to emergency rooms when things got bad enough, sit in waiting rooms for hours, see whoever was available. The doctors would prescribe medications she sometimes couldn't afford to fill. She'd skip doses to make them last longer. Her body was failing the way the house was failing, through neglect and lack of resources. By 2008, Victoria rarely left the house, except for necessities. Grocery store once a week. Doctor when absolutely necessary. Church on major holidays, sitting in the back, leaving before anyone could talk to her. The outside world felt hostile and exhausting. The house was terrible, but it was familiar. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew which rooms were warmest in winter. She knew how to navigate her own deterioration. She thought about dying sometimes, not suicide. She was too Catholic for that, or too cowardly, or too stubborn, but just dying. Going to sleep and not waking up, having a heart attack while cooking, something quick and final that would end the waiting. Because that's what her life had become, waiting. She didn't know what she was waiting for. For something to change, maybe. For someone to care. For permission to stop performing survival. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up without her. She saw them in photos Angela brought, or in articles about Victoria Jr.'s life. They were strangers, beautiful, well-dressed strangers who would never know her, who would maybe read about her someday in books about their grandfather and think of her as background, as set dressing in the story of important men. In 2009, John Jr. finally walked away from the life. After 4 trials and years of legal battles, he announced he was done, retired, no longer part of the Gambino family. The decision was reported in newspapers like it was a major event. Victoria read the articles and felt nothing. Her son had spent 20 years trying to be his father and had finally figured out it was impossible. She should have been relieved. Instead, she just felt tired. She was 67 years old. She'd been a widow for 7 years. She lived in a crumbling mansion in Howard Beach with no money, failing health, and children who visited out of obligation, if at all. She spent her days cleaning rooms no one would see and cooking meals she'd eat alone. At night, she'd sit in the living room with the television on for noise and wonder how this had become her life. There were moments, rare, brief, when she'd remember being 19, meeting John at that club, thinking he was going to save her from something. She couldn't remember what she'd thought she needed saving from. Her parents, Brooklyn, herself. Whatever it was, John hadn't saved her. He'd just replaced one trap with another. Larger, more expensive, and infinitely more isolating. She kept living because stopping wasn't an option. She woke up every morning in a bed too big for one person. She made coffee in a kitchen designed for a family. She moved through rooms that echoed with her own footsteps. And she waited. For what? She didn't know. Maybe just for it to be over. The biographies started appearing in the late 2000s. Thick books with John's face on the cover, titles promising to reveal the truth about the Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the last real gangster. Victoria saw them in bookstores when she still went to bookstores. She never bought them. She knew what was in them, hundreds of pages about John's rise and fall, his murders and trials, his style and charisma. And in all those pages, she appeared maybe 3 times. John married Victoria DiGiorgio in 1962. Victoria stood by him through multiple trials. He is survived by his wife, Victoria. 3 sentences for 40 years of marriage. She was a footnote in someone else's story. The documentaries were worse. They'd use the same photos over and over. Victoria in the background at the courthouse. Victoria getting into a car. Victoria at the funeral. Sometimes they'd interview people who claimed to know her. She was very devoted to John. She kept the family together. She suffered in silence. The descriptions were generic enough to apply to anyone. No one asked what she actually thought, what she felt, what she wanted. She was context, not character. In 2010, a journalist called the house. How he got the number, Victoria didn't know. He said he was writing a book about John and wanted to interview her. Get her perspective. Let her tell her side of the story. Victoria listened to his pitch, the promises of fairness, of finally being heard, and said no. He called back twice more. She stopped answering the phone. What would she have said anyway? That she'd married a man she barely knew and spent 4 decades regretting it? That she'd raised 5 children in a house funded by extortion and murder? That she'd watched her son die and her husband order another man's death in response and said nothing? That she'd been complicit in all of it through her silence, her cooperation, her refusal to leave? The truth wouldn't fit in a book. It was too complicated and too simple at the same time. She'd made choices, bad choices, or maybe the only choices available to her. She'd stayed when she could have left, except she couldn't have left. Where would she have gone? With what money? With what skills? Taking which children? The questions multiplied until the idea of leaving became impossible, and impossibility became acceptance, and acceptance became 40 years. Victoria Jr.'s books kept coming. After This Is My Story came novels, I'll Be Watching You, Superstar, The Gotti's Daughter, each one capitalizing on the family name in different ways. Some were thinly veiled autobiography. Others were pure fiction, using Gotti as a brand. Victoria Sr. didn't read any of them, but she heard about them. People would mention them casually, not realizing or not caring that they were talking about Victoria's life repackaged as entertainment. She never confronted her daughter about it. What would be the point? Victoria Jr. was surviving the only way she knew how, by selling the story of her damage to anyone who would buy it. Victoria Sr. had survived by staying silent. Neither strategy had resulted in happiness. At least Victoria Jr. was getting paid. The house continued falling apart. In 2011, a pipe burst in the winter and flooded the basement. Victoria didn't have the money to fix it properly. A neighbor's son came over and did a temporary repair that held for a while and then didn't. The basement stayed damp, developing mold that crept up into the first floor. Victoria could smell it, a musty, rotting smell that reminded her of decay. She stopped using whole sections of the house. The dining room was empty of furniture anyway. 2 of the bedrooms upstairs were uninhabitable. She lived primarily in the kitchen, the living room, and her bedroom. The house had shrunk around her, or she'd shrunk to fit the house. Either way, she occupied less space every year. In 2012, she had a small stroke. She was alone in the house when it happened. Sudden dizziness, her left side going numb, difficulty speaking. She managed to call 911 and sat on the kitchen floor waiting for the ambulance. The paramedics arrived and found her there, a 70-year-old woman in a bathrobe in a crumbling mansion, alone. They asked if there was anyone they should call. She said no. The hospital kept her for 3 days. Doctors ran tests and said she'd been lucky, that the stroke was minor, that she should make a full recovery. They asked about her living situation, whether she had help at home, whether someone could check on her. Victoria lied and said yes. They prescribed medications and physical therapy and sent her home in a taxi. She didn't do the physical therapy. She couldn't afford it, and the idea of having strangers in the house was intolerable. The weakness in her left side gradually improved on its own. She learned to compensate for what didn't come back. She walked more slowly, held railings, avoided carrying heavy things. The stroke had aged her visibly. She moved like an old woman now, because she was an old woman. Angela visited after hearing about the stroke. She brought food and cleaning supplies and made noises about Victoria moving in with her, or into assisted living, or at least getting help. Victoria refused all of it. The house was hers. The prison was hers. She'd earned it through 40 years of service. She would die in it, probably soon, and that felt like the only appropriate ending. "You can't keep living like this," Angela said, looking around the deteriorating kitchen. "I've been living like this for 50 years, Victoria said. "I don't know how to live any other way." Angela left and didn't come back for 6 months. The neighborhood changed completely by 2013. The house on one side was sold to a young couple with a baby. The house on the other side was demolished and rebuilt as something modern and expensive. Victoria's house sat between them like a ruin, a reminder of something everyone wanted to forget. The new neighbors complained to the city about code violations. Inspectors came, issued citations, imposed fines Victoria couldn't pay. She received a letter in 2014 from the city threatening foreclosure if the fines and back taxes weren't paid. The amount was more money than Victoria had seen in years. She sat with the letter at the kitchen table and tried to figure out what to do. Sell the house. She'd get almost nothing for it in its current condition. Ask the children for money? Angela had her own problems. Victoria Jr. would probably buy the house just to write a book about it. John Jr. was barely supporting himself. Peter was gone. She did nothing. The city sent more letters, then a final notice. The foreclosure process started. Victoria watched it happen with the detachment of someone watching weather. This was inevitable. Everything had been inevitable from the moment she'd said yes to John Gotti in 1962. But then John Jr. stepped in. He borrowed money, called in favors, negotiated with the city. He paid the back taxes and enough of the fines to stop the foreclosure. Victoria didn't thank him. She didn't know how to thank someone for keeping her in a prison she simultaneously wanted to leave and couldn't abandon. "You should sell it," John Jr. said. "Move somewhere smaller, somewhere you can manage." "This is all I have," Victoria said. "It's killing you." Victoria looked at her son, 48 years old, graying, carrying his father's face and some of his father's damage, but not all of it. "I know," she said. He left and didn't press the issue. The house was hers for now. How much longer, nobody knew. In 2015, Victoria turned 73. No one called. No one visited. She made herself a small cake and sat alone in the kitchen, eating it directly from the pan. The house was silent except for the television in the other room playing a show she wasn't watching. This was her life. This had always been her life. Alone in a house too big for one person, waiting for nothing. She thought about Frank sometimes. He'd be 45 now if he'd lived. Maybe married, maybe with children of his own. Maybe he'd have gotten out, left New York, become something other than a Gotti. But he'd died at 12, and Victoria had spent 35 years wondering if that was mercy or tragedy. Both, probably, like everything else in this family. The historians and crime writers kept writing about John. New books, new documentaries, new articles on anniversaries of his death or his convictions. They'd interview the same people, FBI agents, prosecutors, former mobsters. Sometimes they'd mention Victoria in passing. His wife Victoria remained loyal throughout. She never cooperated with authorities. She died in obscurity. Except she wasn't dead yet. She was still here, in the house in Howard Beach, invisible but not gone, moving through rooms that smelled of mold and old cologne, cooking meals she'd eat alone, sleeping in a bed she'd never shared with anyone who actually wanted to be there. Still alive, still waiting, still performing the role of Victoria Gotti, even though there was no audience left to see it. The photographs from when she was young showed a pretty girl with dark eyes and careful posture. The woman in the mirror now bore no resemblance to that girl. 73 years old, overweight, gray, tired down to her bones. Where had that girl gone? Victoria couldn't remember. Somewhere between 19 and 73, between Brooklyn and Howard Beach, between John Gotti's courtship and John Gotti's death, the girl had disappeared and left behind the stranger. She existed now in the gaps of other people's stories. Victoria Jr.'s books mentioned her peripherally. John Jr.'s life story included her as background. The biographies of John reduced her to a sentence or two. Even in her own family's mythology, she was barely there, a supporting character in everyone else's drama, a name in a credit sequence, here and then gone, present but not visible. And the terrible truth, the one Victoria could barely admit to herself in the dark hours before dawn, was that she didn't know who she would have been without John. She'd organized her entire identity around him, resisting him, supporting him, surviving him, outliving him. Without him, she was nothing. Just an old woman in a falling down house in Queens, waiting for death and whatever came after. If anything came after, she'd made choices. She told herself that sometimes, tried to believe it. She'd chosen to marry John, chosen to stay, chosen silence over testimony. But the choices had been made by a 19-year-old girl who didn't know what she was choosing, and by the time Victoria understood what she'd chosen, it was too late to choose differently. So she lived with it. The house, the damage, the isolation, the weight of a name that meant something to everyone except her. She woke up every morning in Howard Beach and made coffee and moved through rooms full of furniture that had outlived its purpose. And she waited for it to be over, for someone to remember her, for anything at all. But no one was coming. No one had ever been coming. She was alone in the house, alone in the story, alone in a life that would end without anyone noticing. Just Victoria Gotti, survived by children who'd learned to leave her, preceded in death by a husband who'd never really seen her, remembered by no one as anyone at all. Victoria Gotti still lives in the house on 85th Street in Howard Beach. She is in her 80s now. The house is older, too, more broken, more silent, more like a monument to something no one wants to remember. The roof leaks in 3 places. The fence has collapsed on one side. The garden she used to maintain has gone wild, then died, then become dirt. The neighborhood doesn't think about her much. The young families who moved in after 2010 might not even know who she is. The name Gotti means less with each passing year. John has been dead for more than 2 decades. The Gambino family is a shadow of what it was. The mob itself, at least the kind John represented, exists now primarily in movies and nostalgia. Victoria outlived the entire world that shaped her. Her children visit rarely. Angela comes when obligated, birthdays, holidays, emergencies. The visits are brief and transactional. Victoria Jr. hasn't been to the house in years. She lives on Long Island, writes books, appears on television occasionally, and has successfully monetized a childhood she spent decades processing and repackaging. John Jr. calls sometimes. He got out of the life, married, had children of his own. He speaks to his mother with a distant kindness that feels like pity. Peter, if he's alive, if he's still using that name, hasn't been in contact for more than 15 years. The great-grandchildren don't know her. They might not even know she exists. Victoria Jr.'s sons from growing up Gotti are adults now, with lives that have nothing to do with Howard Beach or the woman who lives there alone. Angela's grandchildren were taught to maintain distance from the legacy. They call her grandmother when required, but feel no connection to the word. Victoria spends her days in a routine that hasn't changed in years. She wakes at dawn even though she has nowhere to be. She makes coffee and sits at the kitchen table and watches light come through windows that need cleaning. She eats breakfast, usually toast, sometimes nothing. She moves through the house straightening things that don't need straightening, cleaning surfaces that are never clean. The work is pointless, but necessary. Without it, she'd have to sit with her thoughts, and her thoughts are not good company. She watches television, game shows, old movies, whatever is on. She doesn't follow the plots. The noise is what matters. Proof that a world exists beyond the walls of the house, even if she's no longer part of it. Sometimes she falls asleep in the chair and wakes up disoriented, unsure what day it is, what year it is, if John is alive or dead. She still cooks, though less than before. Her hands shake too much for anything complicated. She makes pasta mostly, the same meals she made for 40 years. She eats some and puts the rest in containers that fill the refrigerator until they spoil, and she throws them away. The cooking is muscle memory now, a performance of normalcy she can't quite abandon. She thinks about death the way other people think about vacation. Something coming, inevitable, maybe even welcome. Her health is failing in the predictable ways of old age. The diabetes is worse, the arthritis makes walking painful, her heart is weak. She's had 2 more small strokes since 2012. Each one takes a little more. Her left hand doesn't work properly anymore. Her speech sometimes slurs. She forgets things, names, dates, whether she's taken her medications. But she's not afraid. What is there to be afraid of? Hell? She's been living in a version of it for 60 years. Judgment? She's judged herself more harshly than any god could. Oblivion. That sounds like rest. The only thing that bothers her about dying is the logistics. Who will find her? How long will she lie there before anyone notices? Will the house stand long enough for them to carry her body out? There are moments, increasingly rare, when she remembers being someone else. The girl in Brooklyn who liked to dance. The young mother who believed she could build something good despite everything. Those versions of herself feel fictional now, characters in a story someone else told. She can't connect them to the woman she sees in the mirror. The timeline doesn't make sense. How did that girl become this woman? What were the specific moments of transformation? She can't identify them. It happened slowly and all at once. One day she was 19, with possibilities. The next, she was 80-something, with none. The house will probably outlive her, at least as a structure. After she dies, when she dies, the children will sell it, or the city will take it for unpaid debts. Someone will buy it, tear it down, build something new. The ground where she spent most of her life will hold a different building with different people who have no idea that Victoria Gotti once scrubbed these floors, cooked in this kitchen, cried in these rooms. And that erasure feels appropriate somehow. She was always meant to disappear. That was her function, to exist in service of someone else's story, then fade when the story ended. John's biographies will remain on shelves and in libraries. Historians will study him, write dissertations about him, argue about his significance. Victoria will be a footnote, if that. Married to Victoria DiGiorgio, 1962, 5 children, remained loyal throughout his imprisonment. Died, year unknown. She wonders sometimes what she would tell her 19-year-old self if she could. Don't marry him? But would that girl have listened? She was so certain that John Gotti was the answer to questions she'd barely formed. Run? But to where? To what? Tell the truth? About which part, to whom, and at what cost? Maybe there's nothing to say. Maybe every version of Victoria DiGiorgio across every possible timeline ended up here, alone, forgotten, waiting for death in a house that feels like a grave she's been buried in alive. Maybe the specifics differed, but the destination was always the same. A woman who ceased to exist as herself the moment she became Mrs. Gotti. The phone rings sometimes, and it's a wrong number, or a telemarketer, or someone conducting a survey. Victoria answers occasionally, just to hear another human voice, even if it's a recording. She never tells them who she is. She is no one now, just an old woman in Howard Beach, anonymous, invisible, exactly what she always was beneath the performance. When she dies, there will be a funeral. Small, probably. The children will come, maybe some grandchildren out of obligation. The priest will say generic words about eternal rest and God's mercy. They'll lower her into the ground in St. John's Cemetery, next to John, because where else would she go? They'll share a headstone. His name will be larger. The dates of her life will be carved in smaller letters. Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti, 1942, TBD, beloved wife and mother. Beloved. The word is a lie, but it's the lie families tell. It will sit on the stone in the cemetery and mean nothing to anyone who reads it. She was not beloved. She was necessary, endured, occasionally pitied. But beloved? That requires being seen as a person rather than a function. And Victoria stopped being a person so long ago she can't remember what it felt like. She sits in the house on 85th Street, and the house sits around her, both of them decaying at roughly the same pace. The neighborhood moves on. The world moves on. History moves on. And Victoria stays here, in the house, in the story that erased her while demanding her presence, waiting for the end that will come and change nothing. She made coffee this morning. She'll make coffee tomorrow morning if she wakes up. She'll move through rooms that echo with 50 years of silence. She'll remember and forget, and remember again. She'll be Victoria Gotti, which is to say, she'll be no one, which is to say, she'll be exactly what she's always been. A woman who gave her entire life to a man who never asked what she wanted, in a world that never cared. The house is quiet. The coffee is cold. The morning light falls through dirty windows onto floors that will never be clean enough. And Victoria di Giorgio Gotti, 80-something years old, alive but barely, sits in the ruins of her life and waits for nothing, for everything to finally be over, for permission she'll never receive to stop performing survival and simply stop.